Today, Donald Trump lied his way through a few questions from reporters about his economic plans, while President Joe Biden described accurately what his policies have done for the economy and what the long-term infrastructure projects he's invested in will continue to do for this economy and for this country for many, many decades to come. Donald Trump pulled one of those classic Trumpian stunts today in which he, as president and the Republicans in Congress, do absolutely nothing. They do absolutely nothing while taking credit for a private company making an announcement about an investment that it was probably going to make an announcement about, and that it might or might not be true, like all such announcements, and might or might not create jobs in this country. This time it was a Japanese technology firm called SoftBank. Donald Trump promised that SoftBank would invest $100 billion in American projects and create 100,000 new jobs over the next 4 years. The New York Times immediately pointed out that this idea echoed a $50 billion commitment SoftBank made after Trump's victory in 2016. That promise was followed by investments in a host of fledgling startups, some that surged and others that ran into trouble, including the co-working company WeWork and a company called Zoom that used robots to make pizza. Now, if you haven't had a pizza made by a robot lately, that's because that foolish investment, announced with much fanfare at the beginning of Donald Trump's presidency, failed completely, and that company that Donald Trump championed as if he created it himself shut down. The same thing with WeWork, which also went bankrupt. While Donald Trump was somehow trying to take credit today for a private company's announcement of its investment plans, President Joe Biden spoke at the Department of Labor about things he actually did in government through legislation that he pushed through Congress with the smallest majority a president's party has ever had in the United States Senate.
We're so damn proud to protected pensions of millions of union workers and retirees. When I signed the Butch-Lewis Act, think about that. Imagine what the average American would say if you were going to do that with their Social Security, which this guy wants to do. Imagine if he said your pension, you can't count it anymore. In addition, we've recovered more than $1 billion in back wages and damages for over 600,000 workers here in America. We push for a right to a living wage and your right to overtime pay. Jobs and factories are coming back home to America because we invested in an American agenda. We're modernizing American infrastructure. Last guy had the job, he had infrastructure week every week. Didn't build a damn thing. Well, guess what? We built a lot, and guess what's coming? We have $1.4 trillion in economic and infrastructure growth. That's thousands of good-paying jobs. The CHIPS and Science Act, investing billions of dollars, building these fabs that are going to house hundreds of people working, thousands. They're going to be getting paid about an average $102,000 a year and don't need a college degree. So much is going on. But it's going to take a little bit of time.
TV news had a choice today. Run video of Donald Trump's lies to reporters about economic policies, or run video of President Biden actually telling the truth about what he did and what he got through in legislation. That should not be a difficult choice for TV news to make, but I think we know how most TV news hours have made that choice. Starting next month, Donald Trump will no doubt be taking credit for every factory opening created by the Biden CHIPS and Science Act. Every one of those factory jobs making computer chips in the United States that will be created in the next 4 years will be thanks to Joe Biden's CHIPS and Science Act. Once again today, Donald Trump lied about tariffs, as he has every time he has ever said the word tariff publicly. And once again, no reporter's question was able to penetrate Donald Trump's lies about tariffs. Here's an example of the gibberish that Donald Trump gets away with reporters when he just decides to lie about tariffs.
If they tax us, we tax them the same amount. They tax us, forgetting just for a second about the word tax. They tax us, we tax them. And they tax us, almost in all cases, they're taxing us, and we haven't been taxing them.
Forgetting for a second about the word tariff, well, once you forget about the word tariff, the word you're actually talking about, then you can say anything. Then suddenly the word tariff becomes the word tax, which actually is fair enough, because as economists and the founding fathers could have told you, a tariff is in effect a tax. It's a sales tax on foreign goods imported into this country. It is a sales tax paid by us, paid by Americans who buy foreign goods. And Donald Trump tells the lie that the tariffs he imposes are taxes that he imposes on China. And he tells the lie that other countries have the power to impose taxes on us. If the United States of America could tax foreign countries instead of Americans, there never would have been an Internal Revenue Service. There never would have been a need to collect any revenue internally in the United States if the United States could just tax other countries. No country in the world has the power to tax another country. The question that I just wish reporters would ask Donald Trump is, what is a tariff? Keep it really simple. It is no longer clear how many of the reporters covering Donald Trump actually know what a tariff is. But it seems very clear that Donald Trump doesn't know what a tariff is or is lying about what a tariff is, and simply asking him what is a tariff could be, maybe, the best way to expose the Trump lie. I don't know what he would actually say to the question of what is a tariff, because it's impossible to anticipate stupidity and lying combined, which is what you're hearing from Trump about tariffs. But here's the answer to the question, what is a tariff? An American tariff is an American tax imposed on an imported product. The minute that product arrives in the United States, because that is the only place where the United States can impose a tariff. And so, at the Port of Los Angeles, when your Samsung television is offloaded from the ship it arrived on, at that port, Donald Trump is promising to add a 50% tariff to that television and all televisions sold in America, because no televisions are made in America. And companies like Best Buy, which import those televisions, will have a representative at the dock who pays the Trump tariff of 50% on your next television. And that television was going to cost Best Buy $100 to import. It will now cost, at the port of entry, with a 50% tariff, it'll cost $150 for Best Buy to take that television off the ship, put it on a truck, and drive it to your local store, where you will stare at its price tag, which is going to be at least $150 instead of at least $100 because of Donald Trump's tariff. And you will then pay Best Buy $150 for that TV, because that tariff is really going to be paid by you on the day that you buy that TV. That is when Best Buy is going to make back the $50 that it paid at the dock, in addition to the purchase price of the TV to import the TV. So Best Buy really never suffers that tariff cost. Best Buy just passes on the tariff cost to you. And you're going to pay it. You're going to pay all of it. That is how tariffs are paid. The only people who can pay American tariffs are you, American consumers of imported goods. Every cup of coffee you drink is made from imported coffee, every cup. Donald Trump wants to increase the price of that coffee at least 20% and maybe 50%, depending on his mood on the day when he discusses his tariff plans. It is impossible for a Trump tariff not to increase the price of a product that is covered by the tariff. And yet the only question that reporters have for Donald Trump about tariffs, and he got this question today, is will tariffs on products make the prices of those products go up? That is not a question. That is a fact. There has never been an American tariff imposed on a product that did not increase the price of the product to the Americans who then bought that product. And so this transition period is a transition from a president who told the truth to the people and to the senators and congressmen about his economic policies, and those senators and congressmen then voted for those economic policies. That's how Joe Biden got majority votes in the House and Senate for his infrastructure plan, for his CHIPS and Science Act, and other economic policies. He told the truth about what the policy was and what it could do. And we are now in the middle of a transition to a presidency with an economic policy built on lies. Joe Biden spoke today at the headquarters of the Labor Department in a building named for Frances Perkins, the woman who Franklin Delano Roosevelt chose as Secretary of Labor to help him lead the country out of the Great Depression in the 1930s through policies created by Frances Perkins and then approved by Franklin Roosevelt and given the new name, the New Deal, by President Roosevelt when Congress passed those bills. But Frances Perkins said the New Deal was born 20 years before the Roosevelt presidency in a tragedy that happened 90 years before 9/11, and like 9/11, included the horrific spectacle of people jumping to their deaths from what was then one of the tallest buildings in New York City that was engulfed in flames.
Saturday, March 25th, 1911. Frances sat down for afternoon tea at her home with a close friend from New York City. Suddenly, they hear the sound of a distant screams and sirens. The building was in flames. Her instinct was to run to the scene. As she approached the fire and smoke, she recognized the Triangle Shirt Factory, a company that employed hundreds of workers, mostly immigrants and women who worked long hours, crammed into tight quarters, where managers locked them inside to make clothing. In an instant, those workers are trapped in a brutal blaze with no safe exit. Some workers forced to climb out the windows, holding on for dear life until their fingers gave out. Others just jumped, prayed and jumped. A total of 150 lives were lost that day. It was the deadliest industrial disaster in American history. Frances was devastated, but that fire ignited a passion in her and strengthened her resolve to fight even harder for working Americans and working families.
Many years after Frances Perkins stood there, watching men and women jump to their deaths to escape burning to death, and heard the thuds of their bodies hitting the sidewalk, Frances Perkins said, that was the day the New Deal was born. The New Deal was a large set of accurately described policies that changed people's lives.
The story goes, after Franklin Roosevelt asked her to become his labor secretary, Frances Perkins immediately responded by outlining her goals, what she wanted done. She said, I want unemployment relief, overtime pay, child labor laws, minimum wage, workers' compensation, national health insurance, and Social Security. Many of the benefits we take for granted as a consequence of Frances' dedication, insight, and courage.
Frances Perkins, Franklin Roosevelt, Joe Biden, they all believed in the government's ability to improve working conditions and improve our lives and improve our economic security. None of them believed that all they had to do was stand beside rich guys making announcements about investments that they might or might not do. More jobs have been created in Joe Biden's 4 years of the presidency than any other 4 years of the American presidency.